Mafia boss wife left him when he went broke. The street food vendor he helped 10 years ago showed up. 6 months after his wife filed papers she had prepared before he even knew the freeze was coming. Dante Conti was sitting on a wooden bench outside a laundromat on Mulberry Street in the Bronx with $2,800 in an envelope inside his jacket and nowhere to be for the first time in 30 years. A woman pushing a food cart stopped in front of him. She said his name. He did not recognize her. She did not expect him to. But the meal she was about to serve him would dismantle a $300 million betrayal and rebuild everything he had lost. Starting with the one thing 30 years of power had never once managed to buy him. She had been looking for him without knowing she was looking. The cart smelled like hot oil and seasoned flour and something underneath, both of those things that had no name but felt like a kitchen you grew up in. The last time she had seen this man, he had controlled 18 blocks, 3 legitimate businesses, and a name that made attorneys return calls on Sunday. Now he was sitting on a wooden bench on Mulberry Street in the Bronx with nothing. Dante Conti was sitting on the second bench from the north end of Mulberry Street, just outside the laundromat with the yellow sign that had been there since 1987. He had been sitting there for 17 days. Same bench, same time, for in the afternoon, when the light came through the buildings at an angle that made everything on the pavement look like it was trying to leave. He was 58 years old. He was wearing a dark suit that had cost $1,800 when he bought it. The jacket had not been pressed in 3 weeks. The collar had gone soft. The shirt underneath was clean but wrinkled in the way that happens when you wash something in a sink and hang it on a doorknob to dry. His shoes were Italian leather. The left heel was worn down on the outside edge from the way he walked. He had not shaved in 2 weeks. His hands were folded in his lap. He was not reading. He was not looking at a phone. He was looking at the street in front of him the way people look at things when they are not really seeing them. The food cart came down the street from the north end just after 4 in the afternoon. It moved slowly. One wheel had a pull to the left that made the woman pushing it adjust her grip every few steps. The cart was painted white with red lettering on the side. Fried chicken, rice, and beans. Sweet tea. The letters were painted by someone who had taken their time with each one. The woman pushing it was Rosa Perez. She was 43 years old. She wore a white apron over a dark shirt, and her hair was tied back with a cloth the color of dried chili. She had been selling food on this stretch of Mulberry Street for 2 years. She knew the regulars. She knew the bench sitters. She knew the ones who had money and the ones who did not. And she fed both because that is what her grandmother had done in San Juan 40 years ago. And that is what she was going to keep doing. She saw the man on the second bench and she slowed the cart. She did not stop right away. She looked at him. She looked at his hands. She looked at the suit. She looked at his face. She stood still for a moment with both hands on the cart handle and did not move. She knew that face. She had seen it once 10 years ago on a sidewalk in East Harlem on a day when she had $35 left and a son who had not eaten since the morning before. She had seen that face step out of a black car and walk toward her folding table and order a plate of food and eat it standing up on the curb like it was the best thing he had tasted in years. She said his name. Not loudly. Not like a question. She said it the way you say a word you have been carrying for a long time and finally have a reason to put down. He looked up. He did not recognize her. She did not expect him to. She had been one meal on one sidewalk on one afternoon a decade ago. He had been the man who changed her life with 4 words and an envelope he never asked back. She pulled a container from the cart. Fried chicken, rice, and beans. She set it on the bench beside him. She did not explain it. She did not say anything else. She just set it down and stood there. He looked at the container. He did not open it. He sat with it beside him the way you sit with something you are not sure you deserve. The last time Rosa had cooked for Dante Conti was 10 years ago on a sidewalk in East Harlem when she had $35 to her name and a son who had not eaten since the morning before. She did not forget. She had spent 10 years not forgetting. Dante Conti grew up in a 2-room apartment on Mulberry Street in the Bronx. His father, Nico Conti, had come from a small town outside Naples in 1963 with a canvas bag and a cousin's address written on a folded piece of paper. Nico found work in a bakery on Arthur Avenue within 2 weeks. He baked bread for 19 years. He smelled like flour and yeast every night when he came home, and Dante used to press his face into his father's shoulder when he was small just to breathe that smell, because it meant the day was over and the door was closed and everyone was inside and nothing bad was coming in tonight. Nico died at 54. A heart attack on a Tuesday morning in the back of the bakery between the first batch and the second. He was found on the floor next to the oven with flour on his hands and his apron still tied. Dante was 16 years old. He did not cry at the funeral. Not because he was not broken. He cried every night for 3 months alone in the kitchen on Mulberry Street after his mother went to bed. He cried the way men cry when nobody is watching, without sound, without permission, without end. But at the funeral he stood straight. He shook hands. He thanked people for coming. And standing over his father's grave in a Bronx cemetery on a gray November morning, he made a decision. Nobody in his family was ever going to be afraid again. He had no money. He had no plan. What he had was the neighborhood. And the neighborhood had its own economy, its own structure, its own rules that ran alongside everything taught in classrooms and printed in books. Dante learned those rules faster than anyone expected. Not because he was reckless, because he was the opposite of reckless. He was still. He was patient. He understood from the beginning that the most dangerous man in any room was not the loudest one. It was the one who had already decided what he was going to do before he walked in. He started by running errands for a man named Sal Marchetti, who kept an office in the back of a social club on Tremont Avenue. Sal was 60 years old, careful, and he recognized in Dante something he had not seen in a long time. Not ambition. Ambition was common on every block in the Bronx. What Dante had was discipline. He did not talk when he should be quiet. He did not move when he should be still. He never made a promise he did not keep. Not once. Not even when keeping it cost him. Sal took him in. Dante learned everything. By 35 he had his own operation. By 40 he had territory across 3 neighborhoods and a reputation that did not need to announce itself. By 45 he was running the most disciplined organization in the borough. Not the largest. Not the most violent. The most disciplined. And that was what separated him from every other man in every other social club on every other block. He had a code. Pay what you owe. Protect who is yours. Never move against a man without cause. Never forget who fed you when you had nothing. That last one came from Nico. His father used to say it at the kitchen table, the same table where he helped Dante with homework with flour still under his fingernails. Never forget who fed you when you had nothing. Because that person gave you something that had nothing to do with food. Dante had carried those words for 30 years. He had built everything on them. He also built things that had nothing to do with territory. He funded the recreation center on 183rd Street when the city pulled the budget. He paid school fees for 14 kids on his block whose parents could not cover them. He settled disputes between families that the police would never touch, and he settled them without violence because violence was expensive and permanent, and Dante had always thought in longer terms than most men in his position. The neighborhood did not call him a criminal. The neighborhood called him when the lights got cut off. When the landlord would not fix the heat. When a kid got into trouble and the family had nobody else to call. He was the system when the system did not come. He met Elena Vasquez at a dinner in Mott Haven when he was 41. She was 36, a commercial real estate attorney at a firm in Midtown Manhattan, and she walked into rooms the way weather walks in. You felt her before you saw her. She was precise and composed, and she had a way of listening that made you feel like whatever you were saying was the most important thing she had heard all week. Dante was not easy to impress. She impressed him. They married 14 months later at a restaurant on Arthur Avenue, same block where his father had baked bread. Elena wore ivory. Dante wore a dark suit. His mother cried from the second row. He did not see the difference between a woman who loved what he was and a woman who loved what he controlled. By the time he understood that difference, it had already cost him everything. Marco Vitali had been at Dante's right hand for 15 years. He was 44 years old, quiet and precise, with the kind of stillness that made people trust him. He had been with Dante from the early days. He had sat in rooms where decisions were made that could never be written down. He had stood at doors that could never be acknowledged. He had carried messages that disappeared the moment they were delivered. Dante trusted him the way you trust a man who has seen everything and said nothing for 15 years. That trust was the most expensive mistake of his life. What Dante did not know was that Marco had been building something of his own for 4 years. Not loudly, not quickly. The way a man builds something when he knows the man across the table watches everything except the floor beneath his own feet. Marco had been moving money, not in large amounts, in amounts small enough to stay inside the margin of error that any operation carries naturally. Small enough that the number at the end of every month was always close enough to write that nobody looked harder at it. Over 4 years, those small amounts became $9 million sitting in accounts registered to names that existed on paper and nowhere else. Marco had also been in conversations with a federal prosecutor's office. Not as a target, as a source. He had been providing information about Dante's operation in exchange for a structured agreement that would protect Marco entirely when the time came. The time came in February. A federal asset freeze was filed on a Thursday morning. It covered every account connected to Dante's name, every property in his name, every legitimate business he had spent 15 years building as a structure alongside the organization. The freeze was based on financial evidence that had been compiled over 18 months by investigators who had been handed exactly what they needed by a man Dante had trusted with everything. Gone. Not stolen. Frozen. Which is worse. Because frozen means you can see it. You can see every dollar you spent 30 years building and you cannot move a single one. Dante spent 3 days on the phone with lawyers. The lawyers used words like asset exposure and federal injunction and timeline of resolution. What they meant was they did not know when it would end and they needed retainers he could not access because everything was frozen. On the 4th day, Marco stopped answering his phone. On the 5th day, the 40 men who had eaten at Dante's table began making the calculation that men in that world make when power shifts. They did not call a meeting. They did not send a message. They simply became unavailable. One by one. The way lights go out in a building when someone cuts the power floor by floor. Elena served the papers on the 6th day. Not herself. A process server knocked on the door at 9 in the morning on a Wednesday and handed Dante an envelope. Elena was not in the apartment. She had left 2 days earlier with 2 suitcases and her jewelry and the small painting that had hung in the hallway that she had always said was the only thing in the apartment that was truly hers. The papers were precise. They had been prepared by a family law attorney whose name Dante did not recognize, which meant she had hired someone outside the borough, which meant she had started this process before the freeze, which meant she had known something was coming before he did. He sat with that for a long time. He put the papers on the kitchen table next to the bread knife he had kept in that drawer for 20 years, the one that had belonged to his father, the one that still smelled faintly of the bakery on Arthur Avenue if you held it close enough. He sat there until the room went dark and he did not turn the lights on. The next morning he put on the $1,800 suit. He polished the Italian shoes. He folded the envelope with the $2,800. A personal account too small to have appeared in the filing, and put it inside his jacket. He walked out of the apartment and he did not know where he was going. He ended up on Mulberry Street. Not because he planned it, because his feet knew the old streets and the old streets were the only thing left that had not changed on him. He sat on the wooden bench outside the laundromat and he watched the street. He had been sitting there for 17 days. Same bench, same time, same light coming through the buildings at 4 in the afternoon, making everything on the pavement look like it was trying to leave. He had spent 30 years being the fixed point that other people oriented themselves around. The man people waited for before they spoke. The man whose phone rang before he finished a thought. The man who walked into a room and changed the temperature of it without saying a word. Now he sat on a bench and a woman walked past him with a grocery cart and looked straight through him like he was part of the wall. He did not know what to do with that. On the 9th day, a teenager from the laundromat came outside on a break and sat at the other end of the bench and offered him a cigarette without looking at him. Dante had not smoked in 15 years. He took it. They sat there without speaking, and when the kid went back inside, Dante sat with the cigarette burning down between his fingers and understood for the first time in 30 years that he had no idea who he was without the organization. The organization had been the answer to every question. Who are you? What do you do? Why does it matter that you are in this room? Without it, the questions had no answers, and he sat with them every afternoon on the same bench and did not know what to say to himself. On the 17th day, Rosa Perez came down Mulberry Street with her food cart, and she said his name and set a container of food on the bench beside him and walked back to the cart without asking for anything. He sat with the container for a long time. He did not open it right away. He sat with it the way you sit with something given to you by someone who wants nothing back, and you have spent so long surrounded by people who always wanted something that you do not know what to do with the absence of it. He opened it. The chicken was fried in a crust that had cayenne in it and something sweet underneath the heat. The rice had been cooked with herbs he could not name. The beans had been simmered long enough that they carried a depth that did not come from a can. He ate the whole container. He could not remember the last time he had tasted food and thought about nothing else. She came back the next day. Day 2. Same time. A container of rice and beans and chicken. She set it on the bench. She left. Day 3, the same. Day 4, he opened the container before she walked away. She noticed but did not say anything. Day 5, he said thank you. 2 words. The first words he had spoken to her since the day they met again. She nodded once and went back to the cart. Day 6. She sat on the bench beside him for a few minutes. Neither of them said anything. She got up and went back to the cart. Day 7, he ate the food while she was still there. He watched the steam come off the rice. The chicken tasted like cayenne and something sweet underneath that he could taste but not name. Something that reminded him of a kitchen he had never been in. Something that tasted like the kind of food that gets passed down not in cookbooks but in hands. He did not know he was tasting a recipe written on the back of a church program in 1971. He did not know the woman sitting beside him had carried that recipe across 10 years and a cross-country move and 2 years of pushing a food cart through Bronx winters and summer heat. He only knew the food tasted like it had been made by someone who meant it. Day 8, he started talking. He told her about Marco, about the accounts, about the federal filing, about the 40 men who stopped picking up, about Elena and the papers and the painting she took off the wall. He told her all of it, sitting on that bench with an empty food container between them and the afternoon light cutting long strips across the pavement. Rosa listened. She did not interrupt. She did not offer advice. Then she asked one question. Do you still have anything? Records, ledgers, anything in writing from the accounts? Dante looked at her. He did not understand the question at first. What kind of records? He said. From your businesses, she said. The legitimate ones. The financials. Do you still have them? He did. He had a portable hard drive in the bag at the rooming house on 174th Street where he had been paying $160 a week since the apartment became impossible to stay in. He had kept copies of everything from the 3 legitimate businesses he had built over 15 years. Every filing, every account statement, every transaction record. He had kept them the way you keep things when you do not know what else to do with them. Not as strategy. Not as protection. As habit. The same habit that made him check his phone every morning for calls that were never coming. Rosa looked at the empty container on the bench between them. I know someone, she said. 10 years before Dante Conti sat on that bench on Mulberry Street, Rosa Perez was standing on a sidewalk on 3rd Avenue in East Harlem with a folding table, a 2-burner gas stove, a cast-iron skillet, and a recipe her grandmother had written on the back of a church program in San Juan in 1971. She was 33 years old. Her son Miguel was 7. Miguel was sitting on a folding chair behind the table with a comic book and a cup of water that had been his lunch because there was nothing else that morning. Rosa had $35 in her apron pocket. She had spent 28 of it on chicken thighs and oil and flour and seasoning. She had $7 left. If she sold enough plates to cover tomorrow's supplies, she could keep going. If she did not, she would have to figure out something else. And she did not have something else to figure out. The chicken was almost ready. The oil was the right temperature. She could tell by the sound. Her grandmother had taught her that you do not need a thermometer. You listen. When the oil stops talking and starts whispering, it is ready. She had 5 plates left when the black car pulled up. It was a dark Lincoln. Clean. The kind of clean that meant someone else washed it. A man stepped out. Tall, dark suit, no tie. He looked like he was between 2 places and had stopped being in a hurry about getting to either one. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the table and the handwritten sign and the skillet, and he did not move for a moment. Then he walked over. He ordered 1 plate, $8. Rosa served it in a container with a plastic fork and 2 napkins. He stood right there on the curb and opened it and ate. He did not sit down. He did not walk away. He ate standing 2 feet from the stove and did not say anything until he was halfway through. "Who taught you this?" he said. "My grandmother," Rosa said. "She passed 6 years ago." He nodded. He finished the plate. He looked at the table. He looked at the stove. He looked at Miguel on the folding chair behind the table with his comic book. He reached into his jacket and put $200 on the table. Rosa looked at the money. "That is too much," she said. "It is not enough," he said. She pushed the money back toward him. He put his hand flat on the table over the bills and looked at her. Not smiling. Not performing. Just looking at her the way you look at someone when you are trying to say something that does not have words built for it yet. He took his hand off the money and walked back to the car. He did not give his name. He did not take a receipt. He got in the car and it pulled away, and Rosa stood there with $200 on a folding table on 3rd Avenue and her son behind her and the oil still whispering in the skillet. For days later a man came to her corner. He said a message had been left for her. A vendor space had been arranged at a market on 116th Street. Equipment had been paid for. A prep table, a fryer, a ventilation setup. The total was $14,000. No conditions. No contract. No repayment terms. There was a note. For words written on plain paper in handwriting that was slow and deliberate, the way a man writes when he wants to make sure the words land exactly right. The food was worth it. Rosa did not have his name. She did not have his number. She had 4 words on a piece of paper and a vendor space and equipment she could not have saved for in 3 years. She kept the note. She folded it into a square and put it inside the recipe her grandmother had written on the back of that church program. She carried both for 10 years. She never saw Dante Conti again. She did not know the full weight of his name. She did not know what he controlled or who feared him or what his world looked like from the inside. She had a face and a voice and 4 words and 10 years of remembering what it felt like when someone looked at her table and her son and her skillet and decided without being asked that what she had was worth something. She did not forget. She built everything that came after on the foundation of not forgetting. The space on 116th Street became the foundation of everything she built after. She ran it for 5 years. She hired 1 person, then 2. She built a lunch crowd that arrived before she finished setting up. Miguel grew up behind that counter doing homework on a folding chair between the fryer and the register. Then the building was sold to a developer and the market was cleared out in 60 days with a notice taped to the door. Insurance covered nothing because the lease had expired and she had not yet secured the renewal. Rosa spent 2 months figuring out what came next. She was not going to wait for a space that could be taken by a signature on a paper she never saw coming. She was going to put her kitchen on wheels where nobody could hand her a notice and tell her to be gone by the end of the month. She bought a used food cart from a man in Queens for $2,400. She got her permits. She started selling on Mulberry Street in the Bronx. Same food, same recipe, same chicken her grandmother had taught her, and that a man in a dark suit had tasted once on a sidewalk a decade ago. Miguel was 17 now. He was at a high school on the Grand Concourse. He wanted to study engineering. He wanted to go to college. Rosa did not talk about that part out loud because talking about it made it feel like a promise, and she had learned not to make promises she could not yet pay for. Rosa did not tell Dante any of this on day 8. She told him later. First, she told him about the person she knew. Frank Delgado was 61 years old. He had a small office above a print shop on Fordham Road. He wore reading glasses on a beaded chain around his neck, and he ate fried chicken from Rosa's cart every Wednesday at 12:30. He had been doing this for 2 years. He was particular about the thigh piece. He always asked for extra hot sauce. He always paid exact change and told Rosa the chicken was the best thing on the street and that if she ever closed the cart he would follow her wherever she went next. Frank was a forensic accountant and former federal investigator. He had spent 28 years working financial crime cases for the government before opening his own practice. He understood the way money moved through structures designed to make it disappear. Shell accounts, nominee holders, layered transfers. He understood them the way a man who has spent 3 decades chasing them understands them. Not from a textbook, from the inside. Rosa brought Dante to Frank's office on a Friday. She did not call ahead. She brought 2 containers of chicken and walked up the stairs and set one on the front desk and carried the other to Frank's door and knocked. "Frank, this man needs 10 minutes. Frank looked at Dante. He looked at the chicken. He pushed his chair back and waved them in. Dante opened the hard drive on Frank's desk and showed him the files. Every account statement from the 3 legitimate businesses. Every transaction record. Every filing going back 11 years. Every communication between those businesses and the accounts that Marco had used as transfer points. Frank read through them slowly. He put his glasses on. He took them off. He put them on again. He did not speak for 19 minutes. Then he looked up. "This is not a freeze," Frank said. "A freeze is weather. This is a door somebody left open on purpose. And I can see exactly who had the key." He explained it in plain language. When a federal asset freeze is triggered by legitimate investigation, the evidence trail runs in one direction, from the target outward. When the evidence trail runs inward toward the target from multiple external points that all connect to one source, that is not investigation. That is construction. Someone built the case against Dante from the outside and handed it to the government already assembled. Marco Vitali had spent 18 months feeding information to a prosecutor's office. Not truthful information, constructed information. Financial records that had been altered to show Dante's businesses as fronts for money movement that had actually been conducted through Marco's own shell accounts. Marco had used Dante's business entities as reference points in his own transactions, creating a paper trail that pointed at Dante while the actual movement happened elsewhere. The hard drive Dante had kept out of habit, not strategy, contained the original unaltered records. Every transaction, every account, every date. The originals did not match the constructed version Marco had handed to the prosecutors. The difference between those 2 sets of records was the difference between a man who was guilty and a man who had been framed. Frank took the case, not out of charity. He took it because this was exactly the kind of case he had spent 28 years training to find. And because Marco Vitali was exactly the kind of man Frank had spent 28 years learning to catch. He made one call that afternoon. The person on the other end had been waiting 2 years for someone to bring them a case exactly like this. Her name was not important. What was important was that she was a senior attorney at the Federal Public Defender's Office in New York who had been building a file on prosecutorial misconduct cases involving constructed financial evidence for 2 years and had not been able to find a defendant with clean original documentation to set against the constructed version. Dante had the documentation. Frank had the expertise. The public defender had the jurisdiction and the mandate. The case moved fast. Within 72 hours of Frank submitting the initial filing, a review was opened. Forensic analysts were assigned to compare the original records on the hard drive against the records that had been submitted to the prosecutors by Marco's intermediaries. The comparison took 11 days. On the 12th day, the review concluded that the submitted records had been altered. Dates changed. Account references substituted. Transaction amounts modified to fit a narrative that the original documents did not support. Marco Vitali had not just betrayed Dante. He had constructed a federal case against him using falsified evidence and fed it to prosecutors who had acted in good faith on information they had no reason to doubt. That distinction mattered legally. It mattered enormously. The freeze was lifted in stages over the following 3 weeks. First, the legitimate business accounts. Then the properties. Then the investment holdings that had been caught in the original filing. Each stage came with a letter from the federal court that used careful legal language to say what it was actually saying. This man was not guilty. This man was a target. There is a difference. And the difference changes everything. Marco was arrested on a Tuesday morning outside his apartment building on Pelham Parkway. He was wearing a gray coat and carrying a coffee. 2 federal agents met him at the door. He did not run. He did not speak. He looked at the ground the way people look at the ground when the calculation has finally stopped working and there is nothing left to calculate. The charges were obstruction of justice, fabrication of evidence, wire fraud, and 3 counts of financial fraud, connected to the shell accounts he had been running for 4 years. The prosecutors who had acted on his information cooperated fully with the review once the falsification was established. They had been used. They knew it. And they were angry about it in the way people are angry when they discover their good faith has been weaponized. Elena's name appeared in the review 6 weeks after it began. The forensic team found a series of transfers. They had been made from one of Marco's shell accounts into a property holding structure that Elena had established 4 years before the divorce. The structure held 2 properties in New Jersey and a cash account with $400,000 in it. The transfers predated the freeze by 3 years. Elena had not triggered the fraud, but she had known Marco. She had known him well enough to accept transfers into a structure she controlled. She had known well enough to ensure that structure was legally separated from anything connected to Dante before the freeze was filed. The timing was not a coincidence. The structure was not an accident. Elena hired a criminal defense attorney 4 days after the review contacted her. She did not call Dante. She did not call anyone who knew him. She called a lawyer, the way she had always handled the things she did not want to explain. The New York State Bar Association opened a review of her license 3 weeks after the federal filing became public. The firm where she had been a partner for 9 years released a statement. They used careful language. They said Elena Vasquez was no longer with the firm. They used the word with. The way you use a word when you want to suggest the person was never fully there in the first place. Her phone stopped ringing the same way Dante's had. Slowly at first, then all at once. Marco's former associates, the 3 men who had stopped answering Dante's calls in the first week, found themselves named in the financial fraud charges as beneficiaries of the shell account transfers. They had eaten at Dante's table for years. They had called him family for years. They spent the month after Marco's arrest trying to negotiate cooperation agreements with prosecutors. None of them called Dante. He found out through Frank, who called him at the rooming house on 174th Street on a Thursday evening and told him to come to the office the next morning. Dante walked from 174th Street to Fordham Road, 14 blocks. He could have taken a cab. He walked. He had gotten used to walking. He had gotten used to the street being the same every day regardless of what his name meant or did not mean. Frank had a folder on his desk. "Sit down," Frank said. Dante sat. Frank opened the folder. He explained the recovery. The freeze lifted. The accounts restored. The properties returned. The total documented loss during the freeze period, including lost business revenue and legal costs, came to approximately $4 million. A civil claim against Marco's estate and seized assets would recover a portion of that. Not all of it. It never was all of it. But enough. Dante sat with the number for a while. Then he looked at Frank. "How much do I need?" he said. "To do what I am thinking of doing." Frank leaned back. "What are you thinking?" It was a former warehouse, 2 stories, 8,000 square feet. It had been empty for 3 years. The owner was a real estate holding company in New Jersey that had been trying to sell it at a price the neighborhood could not meet. Dante knew how to read a building. He knew how to read a seller who had been waiting too long. He offered $900,000. The asking price was $1.4 million. The holding company took it within 5 days. He had the plans drawn up in 4 weeks by a woman named Carmen Ortiz, who ran a small architecture practice on Willis Avenue and who had grown up 4 blocks from the building and understood what the street needed because she had watched it needed her whole life. The Rosa Conti Community Kitchen. A food hall on the ground floor with 12 vendor stalls. A A shared commercial kitchen on the second floor available to permitted vendors who could not afford their own equipment. A small business support office offering accounting help, permit guidance, and access to banking for food vendors who had never had a business account in their name. The kind of support that turns a food cart into a food business. The kind of structure Dante had spent 30 years building in a world that operated in the dark and had never once thought to build in the light. He showed Rosa the plans on a Wednesday evening. They were sitting at her kitchen table on Mulberry Street. Miguel was in the next room doing homework. Dante unrolled the blueprints and laid them flat on the table between the salt shaker and a cup of tea that had gone cold. Rosa looked at the plans. She looked at the layout. She looked at the name printed across the top of the page. She did not say anything for a long time. "You are putting my name on a building," she said. "Your food put me back on my feet," Dante said. "Your name goes first," he said. "Rosa Conti. Not Conti Rosa. Your name first." Rosa looked at the plans again. She put her hand flat on the paper the way Dante had put his hand flat on the table over the $200 on a sidewalk in East Harlem 10 years ago. The same gesture, different decade, different table, same meaning. Dante established a scholarship fund for the children of food vendors in the Bronx and East Harlem. For full scholarships a year to CUNY colleges. Miguel was the first recipient. The acceptance letter came from City College. Engineering. He read it at the kitchen table. He looked at his mother. Rosa looked back at her son. Neither of them said anything. The letter sat on the table between them next to the blueprints and the salt shaker and the cold cup of tea. A kitchen table in a Bronx apartment where everything real was happening. Marco's son came to the opening day. Nobody had invited him. He was 26 years old, and he had taken the train from Queens and stood on the sidewalk outside the Rosa Conti community kitchen with his hands in his pockets and looked at the sign for a long time. His father's name was not on it. He had grown up with his father's name attached to everything that mattered in their household. The money, the car, the apartment, the future that was always described as something his father was building for them. And now his father was in federal custody, and the man his father had betrayed was standing inside this building with flour on his hands and his name on the door second, behind a woman Marco had never mentioned, behind a name his son could not yet place. He walked in. The ground floor was full. 12 vendor stalls. The smell of frying oil and seasoned rice and roasted peppers and fresh bread filled the room from wall to wall. People were eating at long communal tables. People were standing in line. People were talking to the vendors through the open windows of each stall like they had been doing it for years, even though the doors had only opened that morning. He found Dante in the kitchen behind Rosa's stall. Dante was wearing a white apron. His sleeves were rolled up. There was flour on his hands and oil on the front of the apron, and he was standing over a fryer lowering chicken into the oil with a pair of tongs the way someone does it when they have done it enough times to stop thinking about it. The young man stood in the doorway. Dante looked up. He saw who it was. He looked at him for a moment. Then he turned back to the fryer. The young man stood there for 2 minutes. The oil crackled. The exhaust fan hummed. Rosa moved past him carrying a tray and did not stop. Nobody told him to come in. Nobody told him to leave. He walked to the counter. He picked up an apron from the hook on the wall. He put it on. He stood next to Dante. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He just stood there. Dante did not look at him. He handed him the tongs. They worked side by side for the rest of the afternoon. Frying chicken, plating orders, wiping down the counter. Not talking. Not needing to. The kitchen was loud and hot and full of the kind of work that does not require conversation. The kind of work that Nico Conti had done every day in a bakery on Arthur Avenue. Not talking about love. Just being there. Showing up with your hands. Staying until the work was done. That was how you repaired things when words were not enough and apologies were too small for what had been broken. Elena did not come. She did not call. Her story had ended in an apartment in a building where the doorman no longer greeted her by name, and the firm no longer returned her calls, and the life she had built inside the structure of Dante's world had dissolved the moment the structure was gone. Not everyone returns. Not every thread gets tied. That is not a failure of the story. That is the story. Dante stayed until closing. He helped stack the chairs. He helped mop the floor. When the lights were off and the kitchen was clean and the building was quiet, he stood outside on the sidewalk with Rosa. Neither of them spoke for a while. The street was quiet. The sign above the door was lit from underneath. Rosa Conti Community Kitchen. "I still don't know how you remembered me," Dante said. Rosa looked at the sign. "You put your hand over the money," she said. "Nobody who wants something back does that." That was all. They stood there for another minute. Then Rosa went inside to finish closing and Dante walked north toward 174th Street where he still lived because the room had become familiar and familiar was something he had learned not to waste. Marco had his lawyers. Elena had her structures. The 40 men had their calculations. Rosa had a food cart and a note with 4 words folded inside a recipe written on the back of a church program in 1971. Every one of those things was a kind of protection. Every one of those things was designed to keep something safe. The lawyers protected Marco until the records said otherwise. The structures protected Elena until the transfers became a timeline. The calculations protected the 40 men until the calculations stopped working. The note protected Rosa in a different way. It did not protect her money. It did not protect her space or her equipment or her vendor permit. It protected something that has no line on any balance sheet. It protected her belief that a man with everything could look at a woman with almost nothing and decide without being asked that what she had was worth something. She carried that belief for 10 years. Through a developer's notice and a move across the city and 2 years of pushing a cart through Bronx winters and summer heat on streets where nobody knew her name. And when she saw the man who had given her that belief sitting on a bench with nothing, she did not calculate what he was worth. She calculated what he needed. A plate of food, a seat beside someone, a reason to open the container, someone to show up the next day and the day after that and the day after that without asking why. Dante Conti had 30 years of power and lost it. He had a wife who filed before she called. He had a lieutenant who built a case against him with his own name. He had 40 men who stopped answering when the math changed. And the person who gave it back was a woman he had met once on a sidewalk in East Harlem, who remembered what he had done with $200 and 4 words, and who showed up 10 years later with a plate of chicken and said same time tomorrow. The people who leave when you have nothing were never there for you. The people who show up with a plate of food and ask nothing in return. Those are the ones who were always there. You just could not see them when the room was full. You only see them when the room is empty. And they are the only ones still standing in the doorway. Some people build their lives around what they can protect on paper. Dante learned the hard way that the things worth protecting do not fit on paper. They fit in a kitchen. They fit in 4 words. They fit in a church program recipe that travels from San Juan to East Harlem to the Bronx inside a folding apron and a cast iron skillet and a woman who never forgot. If someone showed up for you after 10 years, not because they owed you, not because they wanted something, but because they remembered what you did when they had nothing, would you trust it or would you wonder what they wanted? Leave your answer below. This one is going to divide the room. If this story reminded you of someone who showed up for you when nobody else did, send it to them. They probably do not hear it enough. Subscribe. See you in the next one.